Get away from her!
You're in the wrong house, honey, and you're sure as hell using the wrong tone in front of a lady who's done nothing but offer this world kindness.
The door to this quiet home didn't just open, it exploded, as the most feared man in the Korean underworld stepped through the wreckage to claim a ghost. You are about to witness the incredible moment. Seo Kang-moo, a man who rules through blood and shadow, finally comes face to face with the mother who vanished 20 years ago. But what he finds inside this modest living room will change everything he thought he knew about power and family. This is a story of a ruthless kingpin meeting his match not in a rival boss, but in the unwavering heart of a waitress who has been protecting his mother's secrets for decades. Make sure you watch until the very end, because the final transformation of this cold, untouchable boss is something you won't see coming. If you love high-stakes drama and emotional twists that hit like a freight train, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss a chapter of this epic redemption. Now, let's go back to the moment the door splintered and the past finally caught up. The heavy silence that followed the crash of the door was thick with the metallic tang of gun oil and the floral sweetness of Alara's tea. Seo Kang-moo stood like a statue of black granite, his hand still hovering near the holster beneath his jacket, his chest heaving with a fury that was rapidly curdling into shock. Behind him, Park Dae-chul and Young Min-suk fanned out, their movements clinical and predatory, their eyes scanning the corners for threats that didn't exist. To them, this was a tactical breach. To Kang-moo, it was the end of a 20-year haunting. "Get away from her!" Kang-moo rasped, his voice sounding like gravel under a boot. He didn't look at Alara. His gaze was anchored to the silver-haired woman whose hands were trembling so violently the porcelain cup in her lap rattled against its saucer. Alara didn't flinch. Despite the height of the man looming over them and the silent, armed shadows at his back, she shifted her weight, placing her body more firmly between the gunman and the woman she called Mama. Her face was a mask of calm, grounded strength, her jaw set with a courage that didn't come from a weapon, but from love. "You're in the wrong house, honey," Alara said, her voice steady and low, providing an emotional anchor in the storm. "And you're sure as hell using the wrong tone in front of a lady who's done nothing but offer this world kindness. Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" Young Min-suk stepped forward, his hand twitching toward his side, but Kang-moo raised a sharp, trembling hand to stop him. "I know exactly who she is," Kang-moo whispered, his eyes finally meeting Alara's. He saw no fear there, only a fierce, maternal protectiveness that mirrored the very woman he had lost. It was a freight train of realization. He had expected to find a captor, a criminal who had stolen his legacy. Instead, he found a woman who looked like she would die before letting him take another step. "She doesn't know you," Alara said, her eyes softening but her posture remaining a fortress. "I don't care how many guns you bring into my living room. You look at her like you've lost your soul, but she looks at you like you're the monster who just broke her door. Now, you can either act like a man who has some respect for his elders, or you can find out exactly what a woman with nothing left to lose is capable of." The standoff was a clash of two worlds, the cold, untouchable power of the syndicate and the shivering, raw reality of a home built on survival. Kang-moo felt his emotional armor crack. For the first time in 2 decades, his status as a mafia kingpin meant nothing. He was just a boy standing in a stranger's living room, realizing that while he had been hunting a ghost, this woman had been keeping a human being alive. "Please," Kang-moo said, the word catching in his throat, a sound his henchmen had likely never heard him utter. He slowly lowered his hands, palms open, a gesture of surrender that felt heavier than any weapon. I just want to see her face." Alara watched him for a long beat, measuring the sincerity in his grief. Slowly she leaned back, though her hand remained firmly entwined with Hwasun's. "She's scared, Seo Kang-moo. If you want to be in her life, you're going to have to learn how to be quiet." The air in the room remained brittle, a fragile glass bridge between the life Kang-moo had lived and the one he had lost. He took a single, agonizingly slow step forward, his expensive shoes crunching softly on the splintered remains of the doorframe. The man who had ordered executions without a second thought now found his knees weak, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He sank to his knees on the worn carpet, ignoring the confusion on the faces of his men behind him. To Daechul and Minsuk, this was a moment of weakness. To Kangmu, it was a pilgrimage. He looked at the elderly woman, searching for the vibrant mother who used to hum while she braided his hair, but he found only a thin, shivering version of the woman he remembered. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, and her clothes were modest but clean, smelling of the lavender detergent Alara clearly used. Her eyes, clouded by the fog of 20 years, darted around the room, settling on Kangmu with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "Amma," Kangmu whispered, the word feeling foreign and sacred on his tongue. It was a plea, a prayer, and a confession all at once. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. At the sound of the word, Wasun didn't smile. She flinched as if he had struck her. She recoiled into the cushions of the sofa, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Her hands flew up to cover her ears, and the teacup she had been holding slid from her lap, shattering on the floor, a mirror's image of the broken door. "No, no, please," she whimpered, her voice a fragile reed. She turned her face away from him, burying it into Alara's shoulder. "The fire, the dark men, make them go away!" Kangmu froze, his hand outstretched but hovering in the empty air. The ghost of his past wasn't just a memory. It was a trauma that lived and breathed inside her. He realized with a sickening jolt that his presence, his suit, and his armed men weren't symbols of rescue to her. They were the very cleaning house nightmare that had shattered her mind 2 decades ago. The more he tried to reach for her, the further she retreated into the dark. Alara pulled Wasun closer, rocking her gently and whispering soothing words that Kangmu didn't know. She looked over the older woman's head at the Mafia Boss, her expression shifting from defiance to a sharp, clinical pity. "You're triggering her," Alara said, her voice a firm command. "To you, that word is love. To her, it's the last thing she heard before the world turned into a nightmare. You can't just demand she remember you, Kangmu. You have to earn the right to be a memory she actually wants to keep." Kangmu lowered his head, the weight of his flaw, his reliance on force and power, finally crushing him. He had found his mother, but in his cold, untouchable arrogance, he had forgotten that a heart cannot be reclaimed with a gun. As Wasun's sobs began to quiet under Alara's touch, Kangmu stayed on his knees, a king in a kingdom of dust, realizing the hunt was over, but the war for her soul had only just begun. The tension in the room began to settle into a heavy, somber stillness as Kangmu remained on the floor, his pride discarded among the porcelain shards. Alara continued to stroke Wasun's hair until the elderly woman's breathing slowed into a fragile sleep, her head resting heavily on Alara's shoulder. Only then did Alara look up, her gaze shifting from the mother to the son. She saw the freight train of realizations hitting him, his eyes searching for answers that only she possessed. "It was a Tuesday," Alara began, her voice a low murmur that seemed to push back the shadows of the room. 20 years ago, during the coldest winter I can remember. I was just 20 myself, coming off a double shift at the diner near the docks." She paused, her eyes distant as she revisited the memory. "I found her huddled behind a dumpster, wearing nothing but a silk hanbok that was torn to ribbons. She was covered in soot and blood, not her own, I think, and she was staring at the sky like she was waiting for it to fall." Kangmu's jaw tightened. That was the night of the purge, the night his world had burned and his former partner, much like the ghost, Anthony Duca, had turned the streets into a slaughterhouse. "She didn't have a name," Alara continued. "She didn't have a past. When I tried to talk to her, she just shook her head and pointed at the jade ring on her finger. She was terrified of anyone in a suit, anyone who looked like they had power. I took her home because I couldn't leave a human being to freeze. My mama and I, we fed her, we cleaned her wounds, and we waited for her to speak. But the silence just grew." Alara looked around the modest living room, a space that served as a sanctuary against the menace and wealth Kangmu represented. We put out flyers, we checked the news, but the world was looking for a mafia queen, not a nameless woman in a basement apartment in this neighborhood. Eventually, she just became Mama. She helped me raise my younger siblings. She taught us how to make tea and how to survive when the world gets cold. She's been the heart of this house for 2 decades of silence while you were out there building an empire of fear. The revelation was a massive conspiracy of fate. Kangmu realized that while he had been using extreme paranoia and security to survive, his mother had been saved by the very powerless people he had spent his life ignoring. His reliance on fear had blinded him to the possibility that she could exist in a world so different from his own. She doesn't remember the purge, Kangmu, Elara said, her voice softening with a touch of candor. She buried it to stay alive. To her, you aren't the son who's been searching for her. You're just the man who brought the noise and the guns back into her house. Kangmu looked at his mother's sleeping face, the silver hair and deep lines of hardship, telling a story of 20 years he had missed. The stakes were higher than any arms deal. If he couldn't bridge the gap between his world and this one, he would remain a stranger to the only person he ever loved. The heavy, tactical boots that usually commanded the boardrooms of Seoul now clicked awkwardly on the linoleum floor of Elara's kitchen. Outside, the night was thick, and the street was lined with black SUVs, but inside, the world had shrunk to the size of a 2-bedroom apartment. Kangmu had attempted to clean house by ordering his mother to be moved to a private hospital, but the mere suggestion had sent Wasun into a renewed fit of trembling. Elara had stood her ground, pointing a wooden spoon at the mafia kingpin as if it were a high-caliber rifle, informing him that if he wanted to be near his mother, he would do it on her terms. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on Park Dae-chul, who stood by the refrigerator like a gargoyle, his presence making the modest space feel even smaller. Kangmu, a man who survived through extreme paranoia and security, sat perched on a vinyl-covered kitchen chair that creaked under his weight. He looked entirely out of place, his $3,000 suit contrasting sharply with the family photos and worn furniture surrounding him. He was a predator in a sanctuary, forced into a test run of domesticity. You can't just sit there like a statue, Kangmu, Elara muttered, her tone shifting toward a grounded, weary candor. She shoved a plate of leftover Seoul food in front of him, collard greens and cornbread that smelled of a life he had never known. If you're staying the night to keep watch, you're going to eat. And tell your statues in the hallway to stop scaring the neighbors. Kangmu looked down at the fork. He was a 63-year-old mafia kingpin in spirit, even if his body was younger, a man who usually ate at Romano's Restaurante, under the protection of a dozen guards. Here, his kingdom was a kitchen table with a chipped edge. He picked up the utensil with the same methodical patience he used to dismantle his enemies. The first bite was a shock, not of poison, but of warmth. It was a wisdom from the streets that he had forgotten, that power isn't just about who you can kill, but who you can feed. As the hours ticked toward midnight, the tense, cinematic, and gritty atmosphere of the earlier breach softened into a strange, atmospheric quiet. Kangmu watched through the kitchen doorway as Elara tucked his mother into a floral-patterned bed. He saw the silver hair against the pillow and felt a hope for redemption crack his emotional armor. He was the king, but in this kitchen, he was a servant to a past he didn't yet know how to navigate. His flaw had always been a reliance on fear and power. He had spent 20 years listening only to those with a price. But as he sat in the dim light of Elara's stove, he began to listen to the silence of a home built on nothing but a selfless bravery. He was only just beginning to understand. The king was in the kitchen, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. The morning sun filtered through the modest living room, casting long shadows across the family photos and worn furniture that had become Kangmu's temporary throne. The cold, untouchable Mafia Boss had barely slept, his eyes heavy with the extreme paranoia of a man waiting for an attack that never came. He sat on the edge of the sofa, watching as Elara guided Wasun into the room. The elderly woman seemed less shivering in the daylight, though she still kept a wary distance from the man in the black suit. Elara gave a small, encouraging nod to Wasun, who was clutching a weathered sketchbook to her chest. With a trembling hand, the silver-haired woman approached the coffee table, her movements methodical and patient. She didn't look Kangmu in the eye, but she slid the book toward him, opening it to a page that had been turned so many times the edges were soft as cloth. Kangmu looked down, and the freight train of realization hit him harder than the night he first saw her. The page was covered in charcoal strokes, a cinematic and gritty rendering of a young boy sitting by a koi pond, his face full of a light that Kangmu had long ago extinguished. The boy in the drawing wore a small, distinctive jade pendant, an exact match to the jade ring Wasun still wore on her finger. "The boy," Wasun whispered, her voice a fragile wisdom from the streets. "He stays in the garden. He is safe there. I draw him so the dark men can't find him." A hope for redemption cracked Kangmu's emotional armor as he realized that while her mind had shattered, her heart had spent 20 years protecting the only version of him she still recognized. She hadn't forgotten him. She had hidden him away in her art to keep him from the high-level underworld war that had eventually consumed his life. He reached out, his finger hovering just above the charcoal lines of the boy's face. For a moment, the Mafia kingpin vanished, replaced by the child in the garden. He saw the traces of jade, not just in the drawing, but in the way Wasun looked at the sketch with a compassionate, maternal instinct. His flaw had been thinking that power was built with blood, but looking at this page, he saw a legacy built on a mother's selfless bravery, to remember love even in the face of terror. "That boy," Kangmu said, his voice thick and raw with emotion. "He's still waiting for you, Amma." Wasun's eyes flickered, a buried recognition momentarily fighting through the fog of her amnesia. She didn't scream or flinch. She simply touched the drawing, then looked at Kangmu's face, searching for the boy behind the sharp-featured mask of the boss. The silence in the room was no longer a tense mystery, it was a bridge. The moment of quiet connection was shattered not by a sound, but by the sharp, rhythmic vibration of a burner phone against the wooden kitchen table. Park Daechul, who had been standing guard with the methodical and patient stillness of a gargoyle, snatched the device before the second ring could disturb Wasun's fragile peace. His face, usually a mask of silent, watchful obedience, drained of what little color it held. He stepped back into the living room, his shadow falling long and jagged across the charcoal drawing of the boy in the garden. "Boss," Daechul whispered, his voice a cinematic and gritty rasp that cut through the lingering emotional warmth. He didn't wait for Kangmu to look up from the sketchbook. "We have a leak. A massive conspiracy is unfolding back at headquarters." Kangmu's posture shifted instantly, the cold, untouchable Mafia kingpin returning to his eyes like a rising tide. He stood slowly, his hand instinctively checking the line of his tailored black suit. "Who?" "It's the ghost of the Purge, the rival faction," Daechul reported, his eyes darting toward the window where the black SUVs sat like targets under the streetlights. "They've been tracking our movement since we left the safe house. They didn't know why you were coming here, but they know now. They realize the mother is no longer a ghost, she's a target. And they know exactly which door we kicked in." The freight train of realization hit Kangmu with a cold, familiar dread. His extreme paranoia and security had failed because the traitor was inside his own inner circle, likely someone who feared the hope for redemption his mother represented. If the rivals took Wasun now, they wouldn't just be taking a woman. They would be dismantling Kangmu's entire organization by striking at his only remaining heartbeat. Elara stood up, her face firm and compassionate, as she moved to Wasun's side, sensing the shift in the air. "What's happening? You said you were the one in charge?" "I was," Kangmu said, his voice dropping into a tense, cinematic register. He looked at the family photos and soft lighting of the room, realizing he had turned this sanctuary into a kill zone. But my world doesn't stay behind doors. It follows the scent of blood. The cleaning house has begun, Young Min-suk added, checking the feed on his tablet. 2 vehicles just turned onto the main boulevard. They're moving fast. We need to move her, boss. Now. But Kang-moo looked at his mother, who was beginning to tremble again as she sensed the menace returning to his stature. The stakes were no longer just about his empire or his life. They were about the woman who had spent 20 years in 20 years of silence, just to be safe. To move her now would shatter her mind, to stay would risk her life. We don't move, Kang-moo commanded, his jaw tightening with a new kind of selfless bravery. He turned to Alara, his eyes pleading for a wisdom from the streets he didn't possess. Hide her in the back. Block the windows. Daechul, Min-suk, prepare the perimeter. If they want to get to the heart of this house, they have to go through me first. The cleaning house had begun, and the air in the cramped hallway grew heavy with the clinical precision of a tactical retreat. Seo Kang-moo stood at the crossroads of 2 worlds, his gaze darting between the door his men were reinforcing and the bedroom where his mother sat, oblivious to the high-level underworld war screaming toward her. Park Daechul approached, his movements methodical and patient, as he checked the slide of his weapon. The armored transport is 3 minutes out, boss. We can have her in the subterranean bunker by dawn. It's a fortress. No one gets in, and no one gets out. It was the logical choice born of extreme paranoia and security. The only way a man like Kang-moo knew how to protect the things he loved. But as Kang-moo looked through the door, he saw Alara kneeling by Hwa-sun, showing her how to press a dried flower into the sketchbook. The room was filled with soft lighting and worn furniture, a sanctuary built on 20 years of kindness. He knew that dragging her into a concrete bunker would be like shattering her mind all over again. To save her life, he might have to destroy the woman she had become. If you take her, Alara said, her voice a low wisdom from the streets, that cut through the tension. You're just finishing what those men started 20 years ago. You'll have a body to protect, but you won't have a mother. She's finally found peace in this house. You have to decide if you're here to rescue her or to kidnap her. The stakes were absolute. If he took her to the bunker, she would be safe from bullets but lost to the dark men of her own trauma. If he let her stay, he would have to turn this modest apartment into a battlefield. His flaw, the belief that everything could be solved by force, clashed with a burgeoning hope for redemption. Kang-moo felt his emotional armor crack. He looked at the silver hair of the woman who didn't remember his name but knew the shape of his childhood face in a drawing. He realized that a king who hides his treasure in a dark hole eventually forgets why it was valuable. Cancel the transport, Kang-moo commanded, his voice a cinematic and gritty rumble. Daechul froze. Boss, the risk is losing her twice. Kang-moo interrupted, his jaw tight. She stays here. This is her home. If the syndicate wants her, they'll have to burn me to the ground in this kitchen. He chose the selfless bravery of the waitress over the tactical safety of the mob. He would not be the man who took her away from the light. Instead, he would be the shield that kept the darkness from ever crossing her threshold again. The street lamps outside Alara's window flickered and died, plunging the neighborhood into a suffocating, artificial darkness. Seo Kang-moo felt the shift in the air, a freight train of impending violence, before the first black sedan even rounded the corner. He didn't need a monitor to know that the cleaning house had arrived at the front door. Inside the apartment, the soft lighting of the living room felt like a neon target. Now! Kang-moo hissed, his voice a cinematic and gritty command that brooked no argument. Alara didn't hesitate. Her selfless bravery had been forged in a different kind of fire, but it burned just as bright as any soldier's. While Kang-moo's henchmen, Park Daechul and young Min-suk, took their positions by the windows with the methodical and patient focus of predators, Elara grabbed Wasun's hand. She led the confused elderly woman into the small, windowless pantry behind the kitchen, a space filled with the scent of spices and safety. "Stay small, Mama," Elara whispered, her voice an emotional anchor amidst the rising menace outside. Suddenly, the night erupted. A hail of gunfire shattered the remaining glass in the living room, the tense mystery of the evening finally exploding into an urgent tactical thriller. Kangmu ducked behind the heavy oak dining table, his cold, untouchable mask fully restored. He looked toward the kitchen and saw Elara sliding the heavy refrigerator in front of the pantry door, her strong-built frame straining with a desperation that matched his own. For a heartbeat, their eyes met through the smoke. There was no circle of traitors here, only an unlikely alliance between a kingpin and a waitress. Kangmu realized that his extreme paranoia had finally found its purpose, not to protect a hoard of gold, but to defend this modest, cozy sanctuary. "Cover the back!" Kangmu shouted to Minsuk as a flashbang grenade rolled into the foyer. As the world turned white and deafening, Kangmu didn't retreat toward the exit. He moved toward the kitchen, toward the woman who had kept his mother alive for 20 years of silence. He fired back into the darkness of the street, his lethal skills serving as the final barrier between his past and his enemies. In the heat of the climax of tension, the mafia boss and the waitress stood as one, a wall of iron and heart protecting the silver-haired woman who had forgotten them both, but whom they were both willing to die for. The smoke from the firefight drifted out through the shattered window frames, carried away by a cool morning breeze that smelled of ozone and rain. In the street below, the black sedans of the rival faction were being towed away in silence, the cleaning house attempt having broken against the iron resolve of a man who finally had something worth defending. Inside the apartment, the modest, cozy living room was a wreck of splintered wood and spent casings, but the sanctuary had held. Seo Kangmu stood in the center of the ruin, his tailored black suit dusted with plaster, his hands steady as he holstered his weapon. Behind him, Park Daechul was already on the phone, coordinating the extreme paranoia and security required to scrub the neighborhood clean of the night's violence. But as his lead henchman approached to suggest a move to a secondary safe house, Kangmu simply raised a hand, silencing the machinery of his empire. He walked toward the kitchen, where Elara was helping Wasun out from behind the reinforced barricade of the pantry. The elderly woman's face was frail but alert, her eyes searching the room until they landed on Kangmu. For the first time, she didn't flinch. She saw the man who had stood between her and the dark men, and a flicker of buried recognition warmed her expression. She reached out, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his jacket, and gave a small, tired nod of thanks. "You can't go back, can you?" Elara asked, her voice carrying a wisdom from the streets, as she watched the sun begin to bleed over the horizon. "Not to the way things were." Kangmu looked at his mother, then at the woman who had become her guardian and emotional anchor. He realized that his flaw, the belief that power was a solo throne, had been replaced by a hope for redemption that required him to stay. To return to the high-rise glass towers of the syndicate would be to lose the only version of himself his mother could love. He was no longer just the boss. He was the son of a woman who lived in the light. "The syndicate will have to learn to run itself for a while," Kangmu murmured, his voice raw with emotion. As the sky turned a vibrant shade of amber and violet, the three of them moved toward the small balcony overlooking the quiet neighborhood. Kangmu took a seat on a worn folding chair, a king who had traded his crown for a moment of peace. He watched the sunset with the two women, one who gave him life and one who saved it. The high-level Underworld war was far from over, and the circle of traitors still lurked in the shadows of Seoul. But as Wasun rested her head on his shoulder and Elara poured a final, quiet round of tea, Kangmu finally knew what it felt like to be home. The new family was born not of blood and iron, but of the quiet, selfless bravery of choosing to stay.